So the idea began after COVID. I had my daughter shortly before the pandemic, and I found it really difficult coming back to work after child number 2. When I had my son, I never stopped working, but COVID kind of enforced a break. So Mother and I found it really difficult to come back. Motherhood was all-encompassing, and I had so little energy and time with juggling 2 small, non-sleeping children. And the first time I made it back to the studio, I just sat down really tired, and I looked around, and there was just this silence because life hadn't really returned back to normal. And despite my yard being this really barren, concreted area, I suddenly noticed all these weeds had been growing whilst I'd been away, and they were really tall, and I was really drawn to the stubbornness of these plants and their ability to survive. And I started thinking more, I started noticing weeds everywhere I went, along roadsides, growing in derelict buildings. And that's how really the idea began, and I started working with them. The idea kind of grew, and I started to think about what actually makes a weed, and what is a weed and what is a plant. And I realised it's all about perception. The idea of what is a weed and what is a plant grows, changes over time, and also history. Like plants we now consider weeds used to be grown for medicinal properties. So I started to think about all different plants and how plants have different meanings for different people and different cultures, and that's how the idea grew. I really like the sunflowers because they were grown from seeds in my garden by my children. And they grew, I mean, they were taller than our garden shed by the end. So yeah, my daughter planted the seeds, and she's 4, and they grew. And we took photos as the plant overtook my daughter, and in the end they had to stand on a ladder and they weren't even reaching the top. But so the sunflowers were quite personal. From the very beginning, I envisaged this installation which was almost like a field or a forest or even an army of these vertical sculptures standing in the room. For me, the word guard isn't about control, but it's about protecting, taking care, and watching over. But sometimes a body of work can be called something in the studio, and over time that becomes its name. And so it's only right that the work, how it's called in the studio, is its name in the exhibition. Early on in my career, I studied the idea of the public monument. Monuments that, for all their permanence, grandeur, cost and placement, never really captured how you felt when you lost someone. Instead, I chose to work with fragile, ephemeral materials that would rot and decay over time, because life is both sad and beautiful. We all have our own rituals, from our morning cup of coffee to how we say goodnight. It's how we make sense of the world. It kind of grounds us in a reality. And it's these small moments, really, that make us human, and they help us to relate to others and to connect. And art is ultimately about connection and communication, and making works that speak to others, not to control or dictate meaning, but a starting point for a wider conversation.